Hi everybody, and yes, this is my latest hat acquisition. It may be the last one for a while. I now have a full stable of hats and no need to acquire any further. But I thought I would show it off for this particular video. And today I'm going to talk about MBTI typing versus roles and the roles we play and how the two can cross-correlate with one another. The thing that brought this up is because last video I talked about what I called normal things and the parents of my Gen X peers and how their parents lived in different ways, and it was just kind of a way that we all grew up with, some having more difficult households growing up than others. I was going to do a follow-up video to talk about what happened to all of these peers, to give a general idea of marriages and kids and careers and so on and so forth, but it seemed at once both too personal and too impersonal. So rather than that, there was a high-level observation here that I'd like to pass along, which is, in my experience, in this small sample size, it seems to me there's a real correlation between those of us who grew up with more troubled households and then correlated to less likelihood of being married, low likelihood of having kids, but having a lot of, say, career advancement. And that's in contrast to those that had stable households where both the parents stayed together, it was a loving relationship, there was financial stability in the household, which seemed to correlate with a higher chance of, say, failure to launch, college dropout, not getting very far in career, but a higher likelihood to get married and have kids. So one is successful, say, in procreation and building the next generation. The other is successful on these surface level of achievements. And make of that what you will. I'm not quite sure what to make of it, other than it seems like some people who had more challenging households had the drive to push in the direction of certain fields and stayed away from others. And it was a flip side, the inverse, for others. But anyway, the interesting takeaway here is simply that there's a nature versus nurture thing, that it wasn't type was not a predictor of success. That is, most of the people in my friendship circle are sensors. In this growing up circle, they're ISFJs, an ISFP, I think an ESTJ, ISTJ, ESFP, and there was an ENFP in there somewhere as well, but it was predominantly sensors. And it wasn't the fact whether they're sensor intuitive or certain types versus others was not a good predictor to say whether or not they would be successful. It was more about what their upbringing was, and I think that gave them the drive either to go in one direction or another, where to focus their energies as an adult. And so this brings up a leap now to another piece that someone cited recently. If you go to the Wikipedia MBTI page, you will find that there's a reference to careers correlating to attracting certain MBTI types or certain characteristics of the dichotomies. And the study that's cited for this is one that's from 1973, so 52 years old, called Relationship Between Selected Personality Characteristics of Senior Art Students and Their Area of Art Study. This particular survey or study found that something like 93% of those surveyed, those art students, were intuitive, and it said something like 33% of these art students were INFPs. When you get to art education, it was like 26% were INFPs, and then for occupational therapy, it was something lower. It was more like 1/3 were ENFPs, but more than 90% were intuitive in the art student world. And this doesn't hold water in my experience. I've known art students, I've known a few people I suspect are INFPs, very few. And those people I suspect were INFPs ended up being in STEM areas, in education, consulting, and these sorts of fields. They weren't in art. The people who I knew that were in the art world, possibly INFPs, but nobody really registered on that front. So what gives here? There's a disconnect. Well, we can go further and look beyond this one study, which the study has, among other, there are some major faults with the study. Let's do that first. One is that the sample size is a total of 93 students. That is, they sampled 33 fine art students, 31 art education students, and 29 occupational therapy students to come up with this, this is 33% INFPs and this one's 28% INFPs, or whatever the numbers are that seem out of line from reality. So the sample sizes were tiny. And the people that they brought in were allowed to self-assess using the MBTI tool of the time. And I think I've said it before, it's not a test. The MBTI, Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, is a tool, and it is frequently applied as a self-assessment tool. So you take basically this multiple choice questionnaire, and based on the way that you answer, based on your self-image, it will provide you with a suggestion of your type, which doesn't necessarily line up with cognitive functions. One would hope that it does, but a self-assessment only goes as far as one's self-image. So we see that these 93 students for this study are not alone in overtyping in the intuitive field. There is a separate study that was done of 115 creative men, they call them. And it turned out that 97% of those creative men that were brought together were self-assessed themselves as intuitive. That included 90% of creative writers, 92% of mathematicians, 93% of research scientists, and 100% of architects, all self-assessed as intuitive. Well, I work in a creative field. I would say that about 1/3 of our creative employee base, that piece of it, are generously 1/3 maybe intuitive, which beats the about 1/4 intuitives in the general population. But we have a generous contingent of sensors who are as talented as any of the people who I believe to be intuitive. And I suspect, given that this is a creative field, if they were to self-assess using something like an MBTI or 16 personalities tool, that they would probably self-assess as intuitive. The reason for this is because we're leaning into roles. If somebody is a senior art student, they have spent 4 years in an environment that is geared towards social introversion, to working on projects on one's own, independently, to build one's craft. And it's also leaning into intuition, regardless of where it is in the cognitive stack. Dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, inferior, doesn't matter. Wherever it is in the stack, the intuition is sort of part of the creative cycle of art. And even if someone's got an inferior intuitive position, they're still able to tap into that, to consider, to draw upon that for their art projects. And because they've been trained to think themselves that way, they are going to lean into that intuition and test as intuitive, as opposed to potentially naturally being an intuitive type. So yeah, this leads to this dichotomy again of, are we typing a particular way because it is our role in life, or is it our actual cognitive preference that we are seeing here that's at work? As you can flip it and say, at the University College of Medicine in Ohio, they surveyed 339 nurses. It turned out that 36% of them self-assessed as SFJs of some kind, ESFJ or ISFJ. Again, it's because the role that's called for in this particular area of competence requires a lot of memorization, a lot of feeling for and empathy for the patients with whom they are or will be working. So all this is to say that we can look at this as one of two ways. If you take MBTI at its face value, that it is, MBTI is kind of if you test a thing, you are that thing. And therefore, if someone leans into their intuition and self-assesses as an intuitive, therefore if they get an INFP result, they're an INFP. But I do believe that what we're seeing here is a lot of taking the same people. If you put them into art school and turn them into art students, they will test one particular way. If they were to go into STEM and go into the sciences, they would test a different way. And it's simply a factor of having things like a strong SI that adapts itself to the requirement, adapts and specializes to the requirement that's necessary for them to use in life. It's a similar thing to say why there's a lot of INFPs that pop up in MBTI, or a lot of people that test for oversample INFPs, because one goes into Myers-Briggs, which is an abstract conceptual framework, therefore requiring one to tap into one's intuition regardless of where it is in the stack. It is something that people will tend to look into at a point in their lives where they might have some sort of some doubts, some looking for direction, some turning inward to try and discover more about the self. So it's a time that one naturally taps into social introversion, intuition, their feelings, so an intuitive feelings-based evaluation of self, and perceiving, because it's not about plans, it's about trying to discover more and figure out as one goes along, what am I and what does this mean for myself? So we see a lot of challenges here about where one self-assesses versus where cognition lies, and then the challenges in figuring out how does one measure cognition successfully in order to say, am I really this type, or did I learn these things and I'm bringing forward certain qualities because they're important to me in this phase of life, or where I am today. And as a final thought, we can bring this all the way back to Jung's original observations. If you go to Psychological Types, chapter 10, he makes these observations, and I apologize, this is going to be broadly sexist, but it is an observation of its time, more than a century old, and therefore I bring it up as something of a historical artifact that still has some bearing today. Now, bring it all home. But for instance, in Psychological Types, Jung observes about extroverted feelers, insofar as feeling is a more obvious peculiarity of feminine psychology. The most pronounced feeling types are found among women. He says about extroverted thinking, the extroverted thinking type, in my experience, this type is chiefly found among men, since thinking tends to be a much more dominant function in men than in women. Extroverted sensing, it says, such a type, the majority are men apparently, does not, of course, believe himself to be the subject to sensation. He'd be much more inclined to ridicule that view as inconclusive, since from his standpoint, sensation is the concrete manifestation of life. It's simply the fullest of actual living. So interesting there that he observes both that SE tends to be, or sensing tends to be, more of a masculine thing from his perspective from more than 100 years ago, but also that he says those SE types tend to deny that they're SE types. They just don't see it that way. They're just like, well, I'm just living life. Everyone does this, right? And that does carry through to today. And then on extroverted intuition, he says, apparently this type is more prone to favor women than men. And on introverted feeling, he says, it is principally among women that I have found the priority of introverted feeling. So yes, it is a product of its time, and I'll leave it at that. But though it is a product of its time, we do see that these sorts of roles do pass into the broader MBTI social consciousness and survey taking. That is, in the large MBTI self-assessments where they divide by gender, they find that ISFJ is 19% of women, but only 8% of men. ESFJ is 17% of women, only 7% of men. On the flip side, ISTJ, 16% of men, 7% of women. ESTJ, 11% of men, 6% of women. And then honorable mention, ISTP is in there with 8% of men and a mere 2% of women. The rest don't have these big shifts in difference, like ESFP, ISFP, ENFP, ESTP. There's some variability, but it's not as wide. Curious, I think, that we see that the 4 SI types, the SJs, are the ones with the largest differences between thinking and feeling. It may suggest, it may not, that SJs with high SI, that feeling and thinking are something of a specialization where nurture plays more of a part in that self-identification and enroll than just nature. So that is where I think there's this possibility that we see the versatility of a lot of high SI types to adapt, to say, okay, I'm now in an intuitive occupation, so I need to be intuitive. I'm now in a thinking occupation or a thinking role, a masculine role, therefore I will adopt thinking traits. Whereas there may still be a disconnect where the self-assessment may say, I'm a thinker, but if we were to look into the depths of cognition, that person might actually, in terms of their skills and abilities, turn out to be a feeler. So anyway, it's all a very long-winded way of saying our roles, the nurture, bring us to, depending on how you see it, our type or to our mistype. And that's where we end up in this hazy ground that's long been contested about to what degree is personality type or psychological type a thing of nature versus a thing of nurture. I still lean heavily towards nature, and that by the time we develop our consciousness, even in preteen years, we're already locked into whatever our psychological type is. But I can see where the alternative could as well be true, that someone could say, well, on this basis, it appears that type could be fluid, that someone may see themselves as being an intuitive feeler, therefore they lean into these things and they become an intuitive feeler or a sensory thinker and so forth. Okay, long lecture. I hope that some of this was interesting. Again, I don't have firm conclusions on this to offer, but I think it's just a lot of interest to see those kind of things that don't add up or they do, depending on your perspective of how you want to look at them. And well, if you have a perspective on how to look at these data, I'm certainly interested in hearing it as well. Have a good end of 2025 and start to 2026, seeing that this is the last day of the year. And I hope that you're well, wherever you may be. Bye for now.